Welcome to the Balance Sheet, where you rise above the noise and learn about the most important business issues of our age. I'm your host and fellow student, Conrad Chua. Throughout history, humans have tried to cheat death. I don't need to tell you that no one has succeeded yet, but that hasn't stopped billions of dollars going into longevity research. What do we actually know about aging and death? I'm thrilled to discuss this and related issues with our guest today, Nobel Prize winner, Professor Venki Ramakrishnan. Welcome, Professor Venki.
Hello.
Professor Venki, could you start by telling us, how did you get into the world of biology?
Well, I started life as a physicist, as a physics student. I never was actually a practicing physicist, but by the time I got my PhD in physics, I realized I wasn't particularly interested in the problem I was working on. But at the same time, I saw that biology was making tremendous advances. And that revolution, which really started off with the discovery of the gene and then half a century later with the structure of DNA, really hasn't stopped yet. And so I decided to go to graduate school again after my PhD at UC San Diego for a couple of years, and then did a postdoc. And that's how I got into biology.
So the world of physics lost a star, but biology gained one.
Well, I'm not sure the physics world lost much. I don't think I was really, I don't think I had the aptitude to really be a first-rate physicist.
Oh, okay. You've spent your career looking at proteins. Why is that? Why is proteins so important in biology and life?
Well, when we think of our genes, people have a vague idea of what genes are, but what genes are units of information on how to make proteins, and also units on when to make them and how much to make them, all of the control elements that go with it. And what these proteins do is carry out all of the thousands of functions of life. For example, because you can see me because there's a protein in your eye that detects light. The reason you can have oxygen in your tissues and muscles where they're needed is because a protein carries them from your lungs through to your tissues. Muscles are made of protein. Even thinking involves proteins in our neurons. And when we fight off infections, the antibodies we make are also proteins. So you get the idea. So the production of proteins is a central process in all of biology.
So in your book, Why We Die, which I thoroughly enjoyed and I strongly recommend people to read, you write a lot about how we gained a deeper understanding of proteins and the components and how when things go wrong, we die. What got you interested in the science of aging and longevity research?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. First of all, my own field of protein synthesis turns out to be a central process that when it goes wrong, also is one of the major factors involved in aging. So you could say I'd been working on a field that's very close to aging, but not actually within it. Now, for a long time, there's not much we could do about aging and death. And it's only in the last 50 years that molecular biologists have made real advances in understanding the causes of aging and how that eventually leads to death. And at the same time, societies are getting older, so there's lots of money being invested into research that has the potential to keep us healthy in old age and keep us healthy for a longer fraction of our lives, hopefully. And coupled with that, there's a lot of private investment, some of which is aimed at possibly driven by people who want to live longer. And so This is about life extension rather than healthy aging. So there's a mixture of motives that's going into today's anti-aging research. And coupled with that, there's a lot of hype because all of us are naturally anxious about getting old and dying. We're ripe for exploitation. And so there's a lot of hype in the field. And I thought that as someone who was in molecular biology, but not actually vested, I don't have a personal stake in anti-aging research. I don't have a company. I don't even have a research program primarily directed at aging, except one of my projects has to do with a process involved in aging, but I don't have any stake in it. And so I thought somebody like me who's objective should take a hard look at the field and ask, what do we know? How do we know it? What are the prospects? And try to weed out good ideas from the hype.
I think everybody knows that it's better public health policies and treatments that's increased life expectancy tremendously in large parts of the world. Of course, there's still some parts that suffer, but we've not been able to increase our maximum lifespan. I think you write in your book, probably the oldest person who's ever lived was probably about 120. Do you think we'll be able to extend that? And is the person who's going to live to 150 already alive today in the world somewhere?
Yeah, so the last part of your question, whether someone who's going to live to be 150 is already alive, is the subject of a famous bet by two aging researchers, Stephen Ostad and Jay Olshansky. And of course, I am on the side that that person is not yet born, because I think it'll be hard to crack that barrier. I don't think it's impossible, because there are species that live to be 400 years with vertebrates, and there are mammals that live over 200 years, like certain whales. And so I don't think there's a chemical or physical law that says, you cannot live beyond 120. It simply happens to be what evolution has optimized for our species. So the reason lifespan varies is evolution selects for a balance between growth and reproduction on the one hand, and resources that go towards that, and resources that maintain and repair our body. And there's no point in keeping you alive very long if you're going to be eaten by a predator or die of starvation, etc., which is why generally small animals like mice don't live very long. And larger animals tend to live, relatively speaking, longer. There's a fairly good correlation. So our natural, the way we have evolved has meant that our sort of maximum lifespan is around 120 or so. And to crack that barrier would require some real breakthroughs in the processes of aging itself, not just curing diseases that we know of, for example, dementia or all causes of cancer or diabetes. Those would only buy us maybe 10 or 15 years is the estimate. But I think if we were able to tackle the fundamental causes of aging, then we might be able to crack that barrier. But that's a difficult problem, because aging is multifactorial. It operates at many different levels and has different causes. And so you would have to, so a single magic bullet that addresses all of these factors is not really, it's not on the horizon, let's say. I would never say never, but it's not on the horizon.
So there's no get out of free kale card, you think, that we could all take?
Well, there are, the anti-aging research community is full of, it ranges all the way from people I think of extreme optimists to people who are sort of middle of the road, and others who are more cautious. if you ask some of these extreme optimists, they would say, well, we're very close to it. And I think that's their view. And my view, I happen to disagree. I just think biology is complicated, and it's very hard to change one thing without affecting lots of other things. And so to do it in a way that maintains us the way we are and healthy, and at the same time extends life, it's not going to be so straightforward.
So, do you see
But
aging
there are
as
things.
a disease?
That's an interesting question. So I was about to say there are things that might keep us healthy longer, by preventing certain processes of aging or slowing them down. The question of whether aging is a disease is also controversial. On the one hand, organizations like the WHO and I believe also the FDA don't consider aging a disease. So, and that's a problem, because then what would you run a clinical trial for if you don't have a disease? But some of the anti-aging community would like to think of aging as a disease, because they say that, well, all of these diseases we acquire in old age, for example, the likelihood of cancer goes up with age, diabetes, heart disease, dementia, all of those things, the chances go up with age. And so you could view aging itself as a disease, and these other diseases are simply manifestations of aging. They're, in effect, a secondary result of aging. But of course, it's not true. We do have people who have cancer when they're very young. We even have people who have diabetes when they're young. So, and there are people with early dementia. So it's not a hard and fast correlation. And the other problem is that a disease is, by definition, an abnormal condition. It's a deviation from health. But aging is something that happens to every single one of us. So how can something that is inevitable and ubiquitous be considered a disease? So that's the argument against it. The other problem I see it is that with every disease, you have a clear diagnostic which says, yes, you have the disease, or no, you don't have the disease. You have, whether it's cancer or diabetes or dementia, or heart disease, a clear diagnostic which says you have the disease. There's no clear diagnostic which says, you are not old, and oh, by the way, you are old. It's simply a gradual process. So I think that the whole idea of framing aging as a disease is fraught with difficulty. Now, I know why they would like aging to be classified as a disease. One of them is to run clinical trials for anti-aging therapies. Because if you have aging classified as a disease, then you can say, okay, you've got this drug that works against aging. But I think there are better ways of doing that. Perhaps we could have markers of aging, and we could allow trials that improve those markers and thereby allow you to live healthily for longer. So I think there are other ways to approach the problem. But that would involve the community coming together on agreeing on a set of markers that everyone can agree that this set of markers can be interpreted in a way that we can understand the aging process.
I think we have a question or comment from Brandon on LinkedIn. Precisely, what are some of these biological markers? Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I just
diagnosis.
Yeah, I don't think it's a. I think those markers can give you a progression. They can tell you whether certain markers are progressing more slowly or more rapidly in response to changes in conditions or due to a therapeutic. What they can't tell you is, are you now old and you weren't before? Because it's a progression rather than a condition.
You wrote in your book about some attempts by Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs to dabble in longevity. And you had one example of Brian Johnson, who he spends, I think, $2 million a year trying all kinds of things on himself, actually. And for those people who don't know Brian, this is a short segment.
Now is the very first time in human history where you can say with a straight face, you may not die.
You believe that?
Oh, there's no question.
It's hard to believe tech millionaire Brian Johnson is 46 years old. But no matter his chronological age, he's striving for the biological age of an 18-year-old.
So, Professor Venki, I think you've been very clear what you think about people not dying, being able to live forever. But what about his approach of saying reducing what he calls his biological age?
Yeah, it's an interesting, he claims that he's a longevity pioneer and he's not worried about being a guinea pig. And what he does is he takes processes for which there is some scientific basis. For example, for a while, I believe he tried blood transfusions by taking blood from his son. And then I think he also donated blood to his father, a kind of intergenerational transfer. Now, this is based on the idea that when young and old mice share a circulatory system, there are factors in the young blood that help alleviate symptoms of aging in the older mouse. So there's some real science behind it. But of course, going from there to applying it to humans would require, first of all, understanding the nature of the effect. So you would have to try to identify what the factors in blood were that contributed to these effects, and you'd have to find out what they did. And then you would have to try and see if you could run some sort of trials, first in animals perhaps, and then eventually in humans. And so my slight reservation about people like that is they're jumping the gun. There is a rigorous procedure that science has developed and medicine has developed over the last century on how to do rigorous clinical trials, how to make sure some procedure is safe and efficacious, how to determine the optimal dose and so on. And so, Brian Johnson may try lots of things, and yes, he looks very fit, but there, I can tell you, my son is 47, he looks very fit, and he bicycles 16 miles up and down hills every day, often to go to work, and hikes up mountains and so on. And so, it'd be interesting to see what he looks like when he's my age, when he's 70, okay? So I think there's the problem with that is he's trying lots and lots of things, so you don't know which of those interventions are actually responsible for his health, or if any of them are. Maybe all he had to do was exercise and follow a moderate diet, and he'd be in perfectly good shape. So we have no idea what this is doing, and also it's an N of one. Imagine doing a trial on one person and then mixing up lots of different procedures all in the same person. It's not the way you would carry out a scientific study. So, he's free to experiment with himself, and that's fine. And he seems like a perfectly nice fellow. So,
you talk about these clinical trials and being very scientific, and that obviously takes a lot of money and time, which I can see would be very frustrating to a very impatient Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur who's grown up in a culture of move fast, break things, and move on, right?
Yeah, I think that is really a problem, is that they come from a digital culture where things happen extremely fast. You look at the rise of OpenAI. Within a few years, it's gone to some, one of the leading AI companies, right? So the pace of innovation in the digital world is very, very fast. and often has completely unintended consequences. I mean, you look at social media and the havoc they've wreaked on the world, including everything from social unrest and politics to mental health, all sorts of things, which are completely unforeseen. These people never, when they put out their products on the market, it's without any thought about what the consequences would be. And I think AI is going in the same direction. And so it's very, very powerful what they've done. But biology is complicated, and the pace of discovery in biology, it is accelerating, I should say. And also the computer revolution is also helping to accelerate the biological revolution. There's no question that things are moving faster, but biology is complicated and takes its own time. And I think these people underestimate how long it'll take before useful interventions are widely available. And getting back to the business of trials, my view has always been that it would be more sensible to take a symptom of aging, for example, osteoarthritis or dementia, or indeed atherosclerosis, or any of these symptoms that we acquire with old age that are related to aging, and ask for interventions that improve those particular symptoms, because those can be classified as diseases. They're clearly related to aging. You would have a very clear diagnostic whether your therapy is working or not. And there's also a sense of urgency there, because somebody has osteoarthritis, they don't want to live with it, So I think there are ways to do anti-aging research, and even for longevity companies to go forward and make progress in this area. But if you just have a vague idea of, reversing longevity or slowing it down in general, I think that's going to be a harder task to achieve on a short time scale.
Yeah. We have a question from Dr. Malav Trivedi, and I'm no expert, so I'm not sure what the question is about, but he says the latest rate of aging for Brian Johnson is 0.64. Do you believe these numbers? Wouldn't it be better to have a holistic approach of the biomarkers, including epigenetic markers?
Yeah, I think the problem with markers is they're all measuring different things that change with age. For example, epigenetics measures the pattern of methylation of your DNA, and that pattern changes with age. And there's evidence that it's a better indicator of your age than your chronological age in terms of predicting mortality and morbidity and so on. And similarly, there are other markers. Some of them measure glycation of your proteins. This is the addition of sugar groups to proteins, especially proteins of your immune system. Or there are markers which measure various blood enzymes that change with age, or blood proteins that change with age. The problem with all of these markers is they're correlated. They often don't give you exactly the same thing. And remember, these markers are better for measuring change than they are for putting you in some absolute data point on a spectrum, because we, as people, are highly variable. So some of us may have epigenetic marks earlier on, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're older in some real sense, okay? But I think they're more useful for measuring changes with age. So they're very useful research tool. The other problem I would say is that people have done studies using markers which show even our organs age at different rates. So within the same person, different parts of us may be aging at different rates. So I think the whole question of biological markers and what they mean is something the anti-aging community has to come together and decide and agree on a set of markers and a panel. I think the questioner, when he says a holistic approach, I agree with that. You need a somewhat broader approach to these markers. But I think these markers are going to be very useful. And they're useful biological tool, and they'll be useful, as we progress with anti-aging therapeutics. It'll be a very useful way of monitoring what these therapies are doing. So as far as reducing it to a single number and rate of aging of 0.64, well, I'm somewhat skeptical, but time will tell.
Kartik asks about the importance of protein in your diet. He asked because in Indians specifically, there's significant protein deficiency in the daily diet. How important is protein in diet for longevity?
Well, protein deficiency is a very different thing. It leads to malnutrition and severe diseases. For example, a disease called kwashiorkor, I believe, is a disease of protein deficiency. So it's very important to get the minimum requirement of protein. But I don't think consuming a lot of protein is particularly good either. In fact, the studies on aging show that dietary restriction, which is restricting the amount of calories and also possibly the amount of protein, is actually beneficial in the long run. But by restricting, I mean not below a certain threshold where you would start feeling starvation or being malnourished. You have to be above that level, but not consuming more than you absolutely need. I think that has been shown to be beneficial in all in many different studies.
I want to move on to the more societal impacts, as we start to have more of an older population. What's your thoughts on the kind of organizational and societal changes that we need to make as more and more of us live longer?
Well, there are going to have to be several things. First of all, there's a whole question of work related issues and retirement and so on. And I think people are right that a hard and fast retirement age is not really appropriate because people do age at different rates. They may be productive at different rates, but it's also profession dependent. If you were doing hard physical labor, such as construction work or long hours of driving trucks or things like that, you can imagine you would not want to continue doing that as you get older. Simply, your body couldn't take it anymore. But even in intellectual fields, people have to realize there is cognitive decline, and you're not going to be as creative or even intellectually as productive as you were when you were younger. And you have to realize that even if you don't like it. So I think a lot of flexibility is called for. And, people also have to adapt to different roles. Maybe they can change roles as they get older, and so that they're still productive and contributing to society. The other is that maybe societies need to figure out how to integrate older people into their communities to allow them to live independently for longer. This has to do with housing and where it's located, public transport, facilities. All of these things require planning on the part of governments, a lot of preventive care for maintaining health in old age, even simple things like detecting high blood pressure or high cholesterol early or diabetes early and providing interventions can keep people healthier. So I think there are lots of things that societies can do to ensure that people stay healthier longer and also are productive.
We had a comment before the show from Ruth on LinkedIn, and she says it's really important to how we think about structuring our work lives, careers, businesses, and workplaces for longevity. Youth bias and seeing 50-year-olds, I'm in that category, as old and past it becomes nonsensical. I completely agree about the ageism bias, but flipping on the other side though, if we have more and more, a larger percentage of the workforce is old, well, in the older category, what does that mean for people coming through, the younger people? Do they feel that their career paths will be blocked?
Absolutely. And I also think, we like to think, I'm 72, okay? And I readily accept that I can't run 100 meters as fast as I could when I was 20 years old, right? But we're very reluctant to admit that we can't perform cognitive tasks as well as someone who is younger. So those of us who are old, also have to accept that we're not as capable in many areas as younger people in terms of absorbing new facts quickly, in terms of what is called fluid intelligence, learning new techniques or learning new ideas very quickly and being able to work proficiently in those areas or work rapidly. I think we also have to figure out how our roles can change as we get older and not, as you say, block the path of younger people. There is a question of intergenerational fairness here. And it's happening now partly because there's a dramatic increase in longevity over the last 50 years. So people are living longer. Eventually, maybe the situation will stabilize and we'll all start living a long time. And then the whole population will reach some sort of equilibrium. So people will die off at the same time as people enter the workforce. And so it may be a temporary problem. But nevertheless, we do have to be worried about intergenerational fairness. I mean, we talk about anti-ageism, but the reality is we do decline with age. There's no question about it. And so, we have to balance fairness to people as they get older with fairness to younger people, and not sort of hog positions of authority and so on, and just keep on going on forever. And it's not just true in academia, it's true in the corporate world. People like power. Once they're in power, they don't like to give it up.
Nikant asks about the quality of a relatively shorter life sounds more appealing than a longer one, where you're totally dependent on others. Do you have any practical advice, he asks, on slowing down mental degradation or degeneration?
Well, I think most of the studies show that all of the things that help with aging also help with mental aging and mental abilities. Things like exercise and avoiding obesity and having a healthy and moderate diet, also getting adequate sleep. All of those things help with aging in general, and they also help with mental degeneration as well.
I think you show no signs of slowing down mentally. But
I actually, that's not true. I mean, I'll tell you something very interesting. I used to do all my own programming. And at some point, actually, soon after I came to Cambridge, and I was only around in my late 40s then, I had a postdoc from Denmark, and I realized this guy could code much faster and more cleverly than I could. Okay, so it's just an example of how abilities do change and do decline with age. And you like to think that you have other qualities, for example, judgment, the somewhat intangible quality called wisdom. But my feeling is that you acquire those up to a point, and then beyond a certain age, I don't think we're much wiser or have better judgment.
No, you're very humble. There is a question here which I think is quite interesting about this debate about living longer or living healthier, right? And this difference between the two. I think when we spoke before the show, you were talking about how, at least in the UK and Europe, there's a greater focus on living a larger percentage of your life healthy, right, compared to just extending your life.
I think, well, most of the mainstream aging community everywhere is concerned with improving health in age. So they're concerned about healthy aging. But there is a fraction of the aging community that's very into life extension, that is, living longer. They call it solving the aging problem or curing aging, as if, it's this disease, right? If you look at that section, they all seem to come from the United States. So I think that there's this, and a lot of them from California, I should add, although there are not a number of people in Boston who are a bit like that. So there is this slight cultural difference. Now, the question of whether you can live, if you improve health, the question of whether it will improve the fraction of your life, increase the fraction of your life that you stay healthy, is not clear, because what that means is that our lifespan would be fixed and you're living a larger fraction that's healthy. And then you'll have some rapid decline at the very end. Well, it is equally possible that if you keep people healthy for longer, you're simply going to delay that process where they go into the slow decline and things start breaking down. So it's not clear that this so-called compression of morbidity, the shortening of the period of poor health, is very easily achievable, although that remains the goal of much of the mainstream community.
Mm. I want to share this essay, actually, that Ezekiel Emanuel wrote. He's, I think, Vice Provost of UPenn. He's an oncologist. And he says he wants to live healthy up till 75 and then refuse all medical treatment, even if he could afford it, even if he was available. His strategy is to try to avoid the four horsemen. I think he says it's cancer, neurological diseases, diabetes. I can't remember the last one.
Heart disease.
But could be, yes. And up till 75, and then after that he lets nature take its course, because he wants to, in his words, die before he gets old. Is that a good approach? What do you think about that? And what's your approach to life? In the sense
it's certainly a very philosophical approach. But I think I looked him up, and I believe, let me just see, I think he's 66 years old. Okay. He was born in 1957, which makes him 66. I'd like to see what he's like when he's 74, because there's an old joke about who would want to live to be 100, and the answer is somebody who's 99. And so I think it's a philosophical approach. It's not one that most people would be capable of. For example, I can tell you that I live a reasonably healthy lifestyle, and yet my blood pressure and cholesterol kept creeping up. And then I started taking statins and blood pressure medication. And my diabetes parameters are also going up. And it may be possible that I might need anti-diabetic medication. So why am I doing all that? Well, I'm doing all that so that I can stay healthy for longer and not just let nature take its course and die of a stroke or a heart attack or something like that. So I think my view would be I would not want extreme interventions to prolong my life. But if there are simple things that I can do, or if there are simple fixes, I don't see the problem with availing myself of that and continuing to live as long as I can lead a healthy life. What I wouldn't want is a prolonged, decrepit life where I'm, struggling and need care all the time. I agree that that's not a great idea.
I think one of the biggest drivers of that quality of life when you reach in your 80s, etc., now is dementia. And I think in your book you wrote that dementia is becoming has already overtaken heart disease as a leading cause of death in England
In
and
the
Wales.
UK. In the UK, yeah.
Why do you see any promising research in treating dementia?
There's a lot of work going on in understanding neurodegenerative diseases. And the problem is it is very complex. And it's complex because the causes are somewhat debated, although there's a general agreement that misfolded proteins that aggregate have something to do with it, or at least are highly correlated with the disease. But therapy for those diseases is proving extremely difficult because how to intervene in a way that addresses a problem is hard. And it's also possible that by the time you intervene, it's almost too late because things have progressed up to a particular point. And so what the field needs also are early markers of diseases, which are very reliable. And then the problem becomes, if you see these early markers and they're telling you that this disease has just started, and in 30 years you'll get dementia, then you would have to take an intervention for decades, for 10 to 30 years. And so the safety of that becomes an issue, and the efficacy of that becomes an issue, because you would have to have 30 years of a drug and tolerate its side effects and so on. It can't have adverse side effects over a very prolonged period, and in order for it to be worthwhile to get you a few extra years, or 10 or 15 extra years at the end. So I think it's a complicated problem, but it is a growing social problem, and it's a terrible disease. So I think there's a lot of hope and enthusiasm for trying to come up with remedies for the disease.
And we have one final question. This is Dr. Malav Trivedi again. He asks, do you believe that the next phase of use of genomic medicine, such as tRNA, will be useful towards longevity? Will it be coming more from pharmacological drugs?
Yeah, I don't know about tRNA or for the use of disease, but I can tell you one use of microRNA. There are companies which are using antisense RNA ways to use RNA to knock down genes. And there are trials to see if they can get these into the nervous system and then simply lower the amounts of problematic proteins that are made that are causing dementia. So I think this is an exciting area of research, and we'll know in the next few years whether it's promising or not.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Venki, for this wonderful discussion and insights. I think on behalf of everyone, I express my hope you'll continue to have a long and productive life, as we all do, right? And thank you to the viewers for your questions as well. The balance sheet will be back on the 28th of June, same time. We'll be looking at AI ethics and implementation. So till then, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.